I haven't really thought out what I want to say today, but I was thinking a little about what what are the kind of categories of triple triad skills and what makes a player great. And I remember a long time ago I sort of talked about I was having a conversation with someone and I kind of wanted to make radar charts with it because I think radar charts are a fun visualization of stuff. We're just going to have this bot make moves against itself in the background. Um, of things like consistency, creativity, kind of aggressiveness, defensiveness, stuff like that. But I think I view it a little differently now than I did then. How would we meet this starter? We'd be very upset at our lack of right power. Given that our only capture in two, they combo back from one. There's a case for blocking one. On the other hand, our captures from six aren't great either. Let's stay on topic. We'll see what it would do against itself. Um, I think I view it more now as how do you maximize yourself as a player such that you reliably reach the kinds of positions that you're going to play well. And there's lots of players who I think play a kind of narrower range of positions very well, right? You can take a weaker player and a stronger player, and there are some positions they will play exactly the same way, or there will be, if they play it differently, it will be of equal value, right? These are not the positions where the differences are made, but they're also positions that you could try to seek out. And man, red really has such a big right weakness here. I think I'd probably just put a card in nine and just try to make the game to the right if I wasn't doing too much thinking. There's not like, for instance, if here, maybe you just go like five, right? And you're like, you can't touch my cards, and I have good attacks on anything you play. I wonder what it would do here. They could also go two and keep Takesis open, but my point is kind of that Takesis won't hit that hard, and it's probably the wrong card to keep. Cool. The bot doesn't play that great that's set here. So I think a lot of the times you look at a good player lose. I was thinking a year or two ago, I was thinking I play more standard moves than most good players do, right? For instance, in a position like this, I'm more likely to play in two or eight than most other players are. Most other players will play more moves in one, four, or seven than I do, and I will virtually never go there. I don't know if I have a game on record ever going in those squares. I'll sometimes play in five, but I am very reliably going to play in two or eight. And you look at other players' games and you find they sometimes go in 1, 4, and 7, and they usually lose those games. And my interpretation of that for a while was this is them having tendencies in squares that they basically shouldn't play in. There are, the solver will show there can be correct moves there. There certainly have been correct moves there, but it's so difficult to correctly conceptualize how those moves work and get it all right in a 5 minute time span that kind of at a fundamental level you want to remove those moves from your game. That was my interpretation. But I think that's wrong. I think that was an error in my thinking. And I think I'm kind of assuming that players are looking for those moves, and some are, but a lot of the times they're played simply because the player looked at 2, 5, and 8 and they thought, this doesn't work, right? Takesis in 8, they go somewhere like here, this looks horrible to me. Let's see how it would play out a game against itself. It would play it out really badly, and second turn would win. Okay, well, you shouldn't go in why are you going there? Why can't we go here or something? You're not losing the game if you go here. It is a tie, right? But you don't have to lose the game. Jesus. Yeah, this also ties. Okay, so maybe there's a tie. Um, but my point is like maybe that's scary, and maybe Takesis 5 is scary, and maybe you check 2, and all that doesn't seem to work. And so players will look to find other moves. Players also have an instinct that I think is a very reasonable instinct of, I am in trouble, I need to do something complicated. I need to not give them a straightforward path. For instance, let's say this move did lose to this. That seems a really obvious thing to do. Takesis is safe, Garnet is safe, right? And I haven't actually checked everything here. It's possible there is still something here, but fundamentally, this looks really dangerous. They have 3 cards safe. We have 2 cards safe. We can't get a third card. Well, we can get our second card safe here, or we can get a second card safe here, but we can't get up to 3 cards safe in reply. This seems highly dangerous, and they have cards well directed towards the action. Right? If you conclude this is bad, you might also easily conclude that 5 is bad, and you might conclude that 2 is bad, and you are left with those are bad, but not only are they are bad for straightforward reasons, right? It's not like the punish to this is here, right? Something that an opposing player is very unlikely to find. The punish, in our imagined world, is the most obvious move to play. And so, in an effort to do something that will at least make it difficult for them, you play the move where it's not immediately obvious how they beat it in 1, 4, or 7. Now, I do think a lot of those moves, actually, it ends up being more straightforward to beat them. So I understand the instinct, but I also think in practice there's pretty clear evidence, at least in this structure, that that kind of thinking does not lead to holding more lost positions. But the line of thinking makes sense, and it certainly does apply in other kinds of positions than this exact one. So fundamentally, I was assuming players were doing something because they valued those moves more highly than I do, and they were getting that evaluation wrong. And I think what's actually happening is the reason lots of moves of move types I don't like have terrible win percentages is because players do them as some form of panic move, which seems really obvious once I say it. And I think I had some clue of this. But, that there are move types that are predominantly played as panic moves, and those moves will end up having really horrible win rates. And I think the difference is not necessarily that those are mistakes or that they value those moves higher than I do. It's 2 things. One is I'm probably getting slightly better versions of these setups than they are, right? If I land in an L, I have planned that L and thought about that L in advance. For instance, I think this video will come out shortly after the Triad Wars Finals video, where I made a move in 8 against a starter in 9, and I was assuming he would play 7, and I was planning my Ls in 6, right? I made my move with my L planned. And then, as he started thinking about his turn, I was just spent the time evaluating my L, and I realized my L doesn't work, and started looking for other Ls. But it was entirely, the whole thinking was, my first move is not just about that move, it's about the L it's going to create. And because I am so focused on that second step, I am going to get L's where I don't have to panic as often, right? Because my first move is designed for the L. The whole goal is to get the right L. And I think other players, adjacent corners or capture plays, are not played with the L's as firmly in mind. Most players, not saying all players. And so the L's they get are a little more chaotic, and it is less clean to find a natural follow-up. So I think part of what's happened is, if we go back to something I was trying to say earlier, is about reaching positions where you're going to play them well, right? I am setting up from earlier on, aiming for positions that I think I can play well and I think are comfortable for me to play. And positions that are comfortable for different players to play clearly looks different. But my sort of starter repertoire, or kind of replies to starters throughout, just using the recent example, Triad Wars, was I was finding it very comfortable to either capture or play adjacent corners and go for L's. And in my first round, I had first turn. In my second round, I had a second turn, but against a side starter. But I did aim for an L against it. Didn't get it, but did aim for it. In my fourth round, I had first turn. Um, but in my quarterfinals and in the finals, those were the only games I had second turn against corner starters. And I was entirely playing those kinds of responses. The only time I didn't, the time I played a far corner, Delial played a move I found incredibly hard to meet. And I was very lucky there was a poison elemental element in exactly seven that I had not planned for, right? Because, well, I think really highly of far corners, and I think there's a certain type of player that should play them a lot. Far corners open up so many possibilities, and far corners give a lot of room for either player to outplay the other. And instead, I was aiming to just get like L's every game because I was comfortable thinking about L's, I was feeling good thinking about L's, and L's also gave a kind of clear path to calculate. And I was relying heavily on calculation ability. And I think players that rely heavily on kind of more intuitive abilities are going to do better with far corners and worse with these really forcing lines. But for me, if I'm on second turn and I can play a two move sequence setting up an L on the second and fourth turns of the game, I'm going to calculate correctly from the sixth turn onward in a tournament format. And so if I can make that sequence in the first two moves, and I see that sequence and I evaluate it as good, that means I've just not lost that game. And not losing tournament games is so valuable. And so if I find a setup for an L that looks comfortable for me, I know I've at least tied that game. And for me, that's an incredibly valuable tool because I don't have to win any given game, right? It's not something where here's my chance I have to pounce. You know, you do get that feeling sometimes, but like I usually have at least even skill with my opponent, which means an extended match. You know, I don't need to increase the kind of randomness in the match or the variability. I'm looking to minimize it. I'm looking to make it come down to like who can sustain a high level over the most games because I think that's where my skill advantage usually is. So, one thing is, can you direct games into your comfort zone? And I think some players go too far on this, right? Some players, you know, you get used to a hand, right? And that hand, say, is a side starter, and you start looking for similar side starters on every hand, and you're not able to vary up what you're doing or adjust it as well, and you are overly committed to kind of less optimal strategies. So I think the place this is most applicable is second turn, not first turn. And it's specifically, I think, what do you want to do against corner starters? Against center starters, I think there's a lot of appealing options. Actually, center starters might be a good example too. Against center starters, do you play in the corner or do you play in the side? Is a pretty big division in what kind of structures and setups you're going to get, right? If you play in the side, you're going to get some lines and you're going to get some J's. And if you play in the corner, you're going to get some slashes and you're going to get some J's as well. But you're also the game's going to work differently if they attack you immediately. Those two structures end up looking a bit different. You end up getting what we might call like the Tetris piece structure out of you know, if you meet a center starter, just putting the cards in random squares. You know, this one often leads to a kind of Tetris thing. Hopefully, you have a big number facing out from seven. Let's put that on the other side of the board. That'll be cleaner. You know, big number facing out, potential. Why can't I move the card? Uh, say here, big number facing out. Pretend they can't take that nine. You know, this kind of Tetris piece type setup is going to come up a bunch more there. Then it comes up here. No, you have to go first. Though it also, of course, comes up a bit here that you get a Tetris piece. But the structures look a bit different, and if you're more comfortable one way than the other, usually if there's a good move of one type, there's a good move of the other as well, and finding your comfort's really important. Against corner starters, I think sometimes it's just like you have to set up against what they're doing, right? Like maybe this position you just have to play Chrono 5, right? Setting up Krelian in 4 and 8 is just so valuable, and maybe let's pretend you didn't have other ways to really attack it, right? You don't have coverage here because of the combo, or you don't trust your coverage, and you do have some coverage here, but you think this is kind of clunky for whatever reason, and you just want to set up. And sometimes there's going to just be like a mandatory move that's not the structure you like, and being able to find that move's really important, not being too locked into what you're looking at. But in general, I would say if you want complicated, messy games, then going in the center and going in the far corner give you and your opponent the most room to get confused. There's a lot of times where someone panics by going in a far side, somewhere like, that's not the person who's to move, somewhere like here. But I think often in those situations, you probably just want to play something in the far corner. I think that's the better way on average to confuse. There are specific reasons to far side, but I think in general, if you are looking to make the game have a lot more possible paths to it, then you probably want to go in 5 or in the far corner. Now, the far corner can sometimes give them an easy path, because in this case, if you no longer have an attack in 4, it can be obvious for them to go in 8, right? Just locking in their card in 7. Now, you won't usually have a good reply in 4 here, so you really want to, if you're going in the far corner and you see they have one side safe, they could block the other, you want to make sure, yeah, I have something good. Obviously here they could plus you, but like something that looks kind of like this. This one, much better version. You know, I have something good that goes in 9. And if you do have something good that goes in 9, then this position is going to be really messy for them. They're going to have a lot of options. There's a good chance they go in 5, they could go in 1 or 9, they could attack your card, they could attack, you know, there's so many things that could happen, and it's all going to look different, and it's all going to have complicated options, right? Now, here, they probably just take your card with something, say this, because I guess this is the only real choice, because you can't take back, but there's a good chance you have the capture back, there's a good chance you have something 1, you could have something in 4, right? There's lots of squares you can have stuff, and there's lots of squares they can have stuff, and whoever can feel out that chaos better is going to have the advantage. I think 5 can have pretty similar effects. 1, you get to sort of set the combos. Given they've played the starter, there's a good chance they will have the starter better covered, but the interaction between the starter and the card in 5, there's a very good chance you have better covered. And if they go, you know, in some distant square, I guess it would be blue to move, you know, the game's going to be complicated, there's going to be options, there's chances for both players to screw up. This is part of the reason that I tend to play stuff like, oh, you have combos in 4 and 8, I'm just going to try to get rid of those as fast as I can. I mean, I'm not sure what I'd play here, but I'm going to play something just getting rid of some of those squares. That's a horrible move. Maybe there isn't a way to here. Sometimes there won't be a way. And if there's something that a player likes to do, if you can find a version of a move that denies their preferred option, that can obviously be very favorable. But my point is, if you lean towards being a player who is more intuitive, and you think you have disadvantages on calculation against your opponent, but maybe a better feel for where cards belong and how they interact, then I think center replies and far corner replies are a really appealing option. For me, I tend to think my biggest advantages are in calculation. And so I do things that say, let's force the action. I do things like, okay, I think I can take this, right? You don't, you know, maybe you can go in 9, but I think I have lots of options there. And if you recapture, well, maybe I have something like 5. I don't know. 8 safe for me. You don't have a good recapture on 4. It's just hard to have sufficient recaptures on your starter, and I don't think you did. And I can force the action. I can get this position. And once I get this position, after you make some move somewhere, there's only 4 moves left, and I know I can calculate that out well. And calculating from 5 moves out is much harder, like exponentially harder than calculating from 4. And so you put that burden on the opponent. And I play a game focused on giving myself calculation opportunities and forcing the action to that point. I sort of look for two move sequences at the start, like capture, force recapture, create two safeties. This should be favorable. That is sufficient to make the move, and I can calculate the rest when we reach this position. The thing that would worry me is something like this, right? This is something where suddenly it's a little more vague. Should I go in 4? Should I go in 5? What should I lock in? This is going to be a harder move for me to meet. This doesn't mean it always will be. Lots of times this will be the harder move for me to meet. But if I knew this was forced, I would play this and know I'm not going to lose this game. Though, sometimes you'll click the button and it will tell you actually blue should win. This time it didn't. Of course, this bot is not very strong, so what it says we shouldn't take for granted. But I look in sequences and I calculate. So I really like adjacent corners and I really like capturing starters, especially how I'm currently playing. That was a little different at the start of the return. I've been through phases. I think players who like other things should play more far corners, should play more center replies. I think center replies are way overplayed and far corners are underplayed for how good they are. But I think that's kind of the type of moves players should be looking for. I will note non capturing adjacent plays, I would also put in the intuitive category and say they kind of leave the game open and don't necessarily make it obvious what should happen, though they can also be forcing. Obviously, all these move types can go other ways. I think the this isn't really the hand for it, but I think the far side is sort of like the far corner in a I'm not going to interact, but I'm going to try not to give you anything to latch onto. I think it kind of needs a couple things. First of all, if your opponent has like safety here, you're really going to be on the defensive. So if they have something like that and you play one of these moves, you know you're way behind. And I rarely make moves that accept that I am way behind. So you usually need coverage of 1 and 3, but more specifically, I think is general advice for these. If you play in 2, you need your hand to be mostly up down. If you play in 6, you need to have a side to side advantage. If you have a if you have an up down advantage, there's a good chance you have 1 and 3 covered. And also, if the game turns into a J, or most of the ways the game can naturally go, your up down advantage will play well. And so I think if you have a really big up down advantage, one of my best moves I played in a game in the November Open GB um, was I met there was a corner that I just couldn't meet at all, and I played a far side because my hand had side to side dominance. It had nothing else going for it. It had nothing versus the corner. It had very little down left power. It had a bit of left but no down. It was a very unpleasant hand, but it actually was one of like 3 tying moves, and one of the other ones was in the same square. The other move there was probably better than the one I played. I didn't play a perfect move, but I was really proud of that move and still am because it understood a way to use these far sides. And I think they should be used less as panic moves and more as direction creating moves. And I think panic moves, you should generally go in the far corner. And the reason for that is it is much easier to force action against a center move. There's stuff that makes it straight lines to calculate. Far corners have the fewest straight variations to calculate where I can just force to some decisive position, and it has the least interaction with what's going on. These are very connected. So I think more panic moves should be far corners. You look at Deli games when he has just a horrible hand and panics, he often sticks something weak in the far corner. I think that's really useful to emulate. I think he's a player who does remarkably well on second turn against strong corners, and that's the kind of player you want to be emulating there. Uh, so I guess what I want to say is figure out which kind of positions you're playing better or as well as other people at the level you are at or aspiring to be at, and try to figure out how you can direct those positions more often. But also, I think a big difference, and I was talking with this a little with, I don't want to rub things in, but a little with Turds after a Triad Wars finals. where we had a kind of weird position. He played a weird move that got him in huge trouble, and and I won the game. And we were sort of saying after, one of the differences there is not that like my random move is any better than his random move, but just I get into those positions where I get sort of confused and play something offbeat with some ideas in mind but haven't checked some other ideas, right? I stay with I I obviously have a fairly wide comfort zone, but I also direct and stay within that comfort zone such that I am more reliable. And this is not like all my moves are better or deeper or anything like that. It's usually triple triad, especially in a tournament format. In a tournament format, unless the hands are really awful, it's not unbalanced enough that someone is lost, right? Someone's going to have an advantage, but it's going to take them actually also outplaying their opponent to win a game, or the opponent missing something big, if you don't want to call that outplaying. And I think I do a good job of minimizing the situations where I can be outplayed. And if you look at the last major tournament game I lost, Seto started in a corner. This was in Clan League. He started something in 9, and I took it. And I thought, I have good play if he goes in 6. I had good reactions to whatever this was. I have good reactions if he goes in 1. And he went in 2, and he set up some stuff in 5, and he had cards that swept the game nicely in other positions. And I had a whole bunch of ties, but I could not find them. I spent a long time looking at some different ideas. I really wanted to play an idea in 7 that didn't work. I ended up playing an idea in 5 that also didn't work. I got scared about 6. I didn't find why it lost, but it just felt really uncomfortable. His combo chain felt really scary. 6 was one of the ways to hold. There were a bunch of ties, but I was not used to defending this kind of position. He had a bunch of combo stuff in the air. It was not at all obvious which square was critical for me to go in. It was really hard for me to start calculating anything because it was hard for me to figure out where to start calculating. What are the key moves? There were a lot of options. It was vague. And Seto was a fantastic calculator, but he also did a really nice job of making the game one where my calculation couldn't come into play and I had to rely on intuition, and my intuition wasn't sufficient. So I lost the game. I played a losing move on move 4, and his win was pretty trivial after that. And I think he played moves such that it was really hard for me to play how I like to play, and I wasn't good enough at responding. Incidentally, just in this position, isn't this a funny setup for A495? Just having a beautiful plus and a 3 and 5 each. It's a funny combo. Clearly, 9549, 1A4A, and A495 are a great core to a hand because this is a very funny, like weird plus. Kind of unlikely to be comboed back ever, given that it has like a 4 or 5 sticking out kind of thing. Goofy. But that was a game I lost, and that was a game because there was something. We've reached a position outside of my comfort zone, and any really good player is going to sometimes find stuff there, but it's going to give them a much bigger chance to screw up. So, as a player, you want to maximize how big your comfort zone is, but you also want to make the most games possible in the sort of core of your comfort zone. And that's how you most, I think, reliably put together good games. And there are players who have wider comfort zones than I do. Um, but I think one thing I've maximized well is how often I stay in my comfort zone. That doesn't mean always playing the same response types, because sometimes that response type is bad. But reliably finding early moves that keep the games under control. And under control for me is different than under control for other players, but under control is various position types that I handle pretty well. I've babbled a long time here, and I'm not sure I've said very much. But I do think the thing that separates kind of good from really good from great players, there are a few things. One is just pure calculation, right? Um, Seto, Delhi, Yojimbo, myself, like the big four. all great calculators. Great Sephiroth, fantastic calculator. I've not talked or played enough with other of the top players, but like outside of Doc Evil, I think that's the top 5 all time, and those are at worst like 5 of the best 10 calculators ever, right? So that's obviously just a huge, huge part of it. But how you handle the game before you get to calculation, and the weaker your calculation is, the more of the game there is before you get to calculation, depends a whole lot on successfully directing the game into positions you will handle better than they will, or you will handle well enough not to lose. And so I think sort of if I was making a sort of radar chart now where I was rating each great player 0 to 10 in various stats, one of them would be how wide is your comfort zone, right? How many different position types will you be comfortable and reliably play well? And 2 would be how well do you direct the game into positions where you're gonna handle them well and you're gonna handle them better than your opponents. And 3 would be calculation. And 4 would probably be some kind of hand building oriented thing if we're thinking about tournament play. Um, Adapting to what the opponent's doing, uh, building hands such that you're likely to have advantages going in, building hands such that you're likely to reach comfortable positions going in. That's really big too. That kind of thing. But I think that's how I'd start setting up a sort of like I used to think creativity was really important, and I do. Like Seto's move in 2 is very creative here, but it's also I would frame it more as Seto having this wider range of positions he was comfortable in because he was able to find this move in 2. I wouldn't have played that if I was him. I wouldn't have been able to find it. It wouldn't have been in the range of things I'd both consider but also be able to pull the trigger on. So I think I'd put most creativity under that category. Because there's a lot of creativity you see which is just poor moves, right? And there's a lot of creativity you see which is really fun and kind of works and kind of doesn't. Um, and a lot of the kind of high level games that are won are someone does something very conventionally. This is another thing I wanted to say. Often games, someone does something very conventionally, and the other person goes off convention and loses. But the reason they went off convention is something I was talking about earlier. It's because they couldn't get a conventional move to work. I think another really good skill is who can make conventional moves work the best, right? Who can, you reach this position. Oh, there was some game I was looking at. I think it was a deli game because it's like always a deli game. But like I thought the 6 capture in this kind of setup looked kind of uncomfortable, and I was looking for other options. And because it didn't line up well, the numbers didn't seem to line up. And then after thinking for 5 or 7 minutes, whatever the time control was, as Dully does, he goes in that square. And then suddenly you start looking at it more, and the numbers are working out. Like it looked a little clunky for some reason, but you spend a little time looking just a little further in the position, and he got it to work. And in fact, it was really dangerous for the opponent. I don't remember if it was a win or a tie, but it really doesn't matter. The point was it got pressure, it got an advantage. It was a very strong move. It might have been a Piggy Man game, actually. It was Piggy or Deli. But this move that I sort of wrote off and started looking for other things, but was the most conventional thing to do, they spent a bunch of time thinking about, and then they did it. And it was a very good move. And it was because they had looked into it a little deeper than I did. And I think that's another good practical skill is instead of discarding the conventional move and moving on to other options, looking a little further into the conventional move can often be a better use of your time than skimming for more creative options. So I don't think I'd have creativity as an axis anymore. Instead, I'd have something like the width of types of positions you're comfortable with. And that's going to kind of include the better features of creativity and exclude some of the weaker ones. Um, yeah, I probably said something in this video. I don't know, just a jumble of thoughts. I like my new visual representation though.